Baruch Hashem, today's daf yomi is Zevachim daf Pei Zayin Zevachim 87. But we're going to start on the bottom of Pei Vav Amar Beis. That we had 2 lines from the bottom. We had said in the previous daf that if there was a korban on the mizbeach, if it burst off the altar before chatzos, then the Mishnah said you have to put it back. But if it happened after chatzos, you don't have to put it back. If it happens before the middle of the night, you have to put it back, the limbs, but after you don't. So now the Gemara says, Itmar pirshu kodem chatzos. Let's say we have these hard limbs that jumped off the altar prior to chatzos, ve'achziran achar chatzos, but he only put them back after chatzos. Remember, we had established that if it falls off before chatzos, you have to put it back. But now it's already after chatzos, so do you still have to put them back? No, Rabbah's of the position on top of Pei Zayin Amar Aleph. So when is their moment of equal? When is their moment of consumption by the altar? So Rabbah says, Chatzos Sheni Ochaltan, that the next night is when it becomes their moment of ichol, and so therefore, if they fall off before the next night, you have to put them back on. If they fall off after the next night, the middle of the night of the next night, you don't have to. Whereas Rav Chisda argues with Rabbah, he says Amud HaShachar Ochaltan. Dawn is the new moment of ichol. Now Rabbah's position makes sense because we've always been talking about chatzos as the middle of the night is the moment of the decomposition. But why is Rav Chisda introducing a new time, the time of Amud HaShachar? So Amri Bei Rav, my time with Rav Chisda, the Gemara wants to know what's the explanation for Rav Chisda. So, and the Gemara continues, Chatzos shein osen lina ose ichol. Amud HaShachar she'ose lina eno din she'ose ichol. So the explanation of Rav Chisda is just like midnight, which does not make lina, meaning there's a prohibition of lina that the korban has to be consumed before the time of the time limit, and that time limit is usually the morning. And if it wasn't, it becomes lina and disqualified. So chatzos, generally speaking, does not make lina, except for maybe the korban pesach. But chatzos does not make lina, but it does make ichol, meaning to say at that moment it's considered like it was fully consumed by the altar. So dawn, which does turn it into the prohibition of lina, for sure it should do this concept called ichol. So now the Gemara asks another question. Pirshu kodem chatzos, let's say it burst off the oil or altar prior to midnight, and he put him back after dawn. So Rabbi Amar, same idea. Chatzos sheni ochaltan. He's consistent. That's still we have to wait till the second night for the moment of ichol. Rav Chisda says ein b'an ichol la'olam. There's no ichol there because the whole concept of dawn and making lina is only after the first night, but not after the second night. And so therefore, Rav Chisda is of the position that there's no ichol there forever. And whatever jumps off, you have to put back, and there's me'ila on it until it becomes like charcoal, and then it would be okay. Because then we don't need to imagine it being consumed; we know it's consumed because it's actually charcoal. Since ichol is this virtual reality, that this is the moment of consumption, why do we assume that it has to be on the altar? Maybe it could even be while it's off the ground. That's the moment where there was ichol. Maybe wherever it is, it makes it ichol. If it was on the altar and it burst off, maybe at midnight it becomes ichol, even if you put it back after chatzos. So that's basically what Rav Yosef's question is. He says, I don't agree with you that you'd have to put it back. Once it's chatzos, it's ichol. Ichol kicks in. So the Gemara says, Shochu misam, they send a message from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, Hilchos like Rav Yosef. In fact, the law is like Rav Yosef, that if it was on the altar and it burst off, then once midnight comes, we assume it's ichol, no matter where it is. So They said the law is like Rav Yosef. And Nimranami, Amar Rav Chia bar Abba, Pirshu Kodem Chatzos v'Chzirin Achar Chatzos Onanim L'Moen. Indeed, if it burst off prior to Chatzos and it was returned after Chatzos, then Lonenin, you're not allowed to benefit from it rabbinically, L'Moen, but there's no Me'ila on it. And so therefore we see that the law is like Rav Yosef, that once Chatzos happens, even if it was off the altar at that point, then the Ichol kicks in. Tana bar kapara, Pirushu kodem chatzos v'chziron achar chatzos yotzim in demi'ila. So too, the Tana bar kapara taught the same thing. Now, my Papa Abaye. So now what a Rabbi and Rav Chista argument if the law is like Rav Yosef achar. So since we've established v'chimei achar the shalchum misamilchos like Rav Yosef, Amar b'chir bar Abba v'chein Tani bar kapara Rabbi Rav Chista v'chein Tani bar kapara Rabbi Rav Chista. But my pligi. So what a Rabbi and Rav Chista actually arguing about? When in fact, we have that in sending the message from Eretz Yisrael, and also we have, it seems like, a statement by Bar Kapara, which maybe was a brisa. Tani Bar Kapara, he taught it maybe maybe he taught it from a brisa. I'm not sure exactly what it means, Chen Tani Bar Kapara, because if it's a brisa, we understand why he's teaching it that way. So maybe that's what's going on, but. Anyway, the Gemara says, how could Rabbi Rav Chista even have this dispute in the first place? But my pligi. So they're arguing about a case where it was bishmenim. They're arguing about a case where it was fatty bones. And so therefore there was no ichul because their fattiness prevents them from becoming charcoal. So there, it's not clear that Rav Yosef would say his position when they were fattier bones. And so therefore that's what they're arguing, whether or not you have to put it back. So now, by minei, Rabba mi Rabba. So Rabba asked the following question from Rabba. Lina mo'eles berosh Hashem mizbeach o ena mo'eles. Here the word mo'eles means disqualifying. Mo'el means usually to help. But here now we're asking the question, if it's on the top of the altar, generally speaking, when something is on the top, that there's this prohibition of lina. So good morning, Jeff. We're in the middle of Pei Zayin and Aleph. So generally speaking, there's a prohibition of lina that you're not allowed to leave something to be expired past its time. Let's say it's on the altar, but it wasn't consumed. So does the prohibition of lina kick in? Does lina disqualify it even if it's already on the top of the altar? Or lina loses its powers once it's at the Rosh Hashanah Mizbeach. Or maybe lina loses its power once it's on the top of the altar. So the Gemara says, why are you even asking this question? Hey, Chidami, why are you even asking this question? If you want to say that the meat that you found in the morning that was not consumed was still on the top of the altar and not in the maracha, not in the fire, and it wasn't consumed. So if that's your question, even if it had been expired overnight in the courtyard, and then it gone up on the altar, Amris the yardu. We would say you don't take it down off the altar. Now that it's on the top of the altar, in fact, would you even think that you have to take it down? I mean, say if it went up when it was expired in the courtyard, you don't take it down. Now it's already up there. For sure you don't take it back down. The Gemara says, no, the question is, Ela the yardu. No, we're talking about a case where it went down from the altar after dawn. It had been up there all night, was not consumed, and then it went down after dawn. So the question is, do we say it's like other linas and it's disqualified, and therefore you don't bring it up? Or maybe we say, no, it's not disqualified because ein lina moelis, it's not disqualified, and you should bring it back up. So the Gemara's question is, do we compare it to the bread that's on the table in the Beis HaMikdash and in the Mishkan, where that bread, the laws of lina don't apply, that if the bread, if it goes beyond its proper time where you're supposed to have removed it, ideally it's put on Shabbos and removed the next Shabbos, but let's say you put it on Sunday, so then you would have to wait another Shabbos, so it's beyond the proper time and doesn't get expired. Do we compare it to the bread? There's no lina by the bread on the table. Or maybe we compare it to the the meat on the ground, which becomes expired. Amarle ain lina barosh mizbeach. No, there's no lina. It doesn't disqualify. If it's on the top of the altar, it's not disqualified. So that's what they had asked this question. Rava had asked it from Rabba, and Rabba says no. If it's on the top of the altar, the prohibition of lina does not kick in. But now we know what Rabba said to his student Rava, but did Rava accept it or not? So that's what the Gemara asks. Kibla mineo, did Rava accept it from him? And usually we'd assume that of course he accepts it. But in this case, we know we have a tradition that he didn't accept. So that's why the Gemara has to go through this question. Did he accept it? Tashma. Deimar, we learned, a varim shalanu ba'azara. So we have a teaching. It said that, let's say there were a varim, limbs that were overnight in the courtyard. They weren't overnight, they were in the courtyard, so you could burn them all night. So if it's in the courtyard, it could only be burnt all night. But if it's on the top of the altar, then you can burn it forever. So yardu, but if it went down off the altar, Rabba Amar Yalu, then you bring it back up, because his position is there's no lina if it was on the top of the altar. But Rabba Amar Lo Yalu, Rabba says no, in that case you don't bring it back up. Shema Mino Kibble Mine. We see from here, Rabba did not accept Rabba's position. And Shema Mina. Okay, so now we said in our Mishnah, Keshem Shem Mizbeach Mekadesh Esarayil. Just like the altar sanctifies that which is appropriate to it, so too does the ram, the kevesh, and so too does a kli shares utensil, a sacred utensil. Mekadesh, everything that's right for it. Tanu Rabbanan Hanogea b'Mizbeach it says in the pasuk, whatever touches the altar becomes holy. Ainli ela Mizbeach, I might think only whatever goes up on the altar becomes holy. Kavesh minayin. How do I know that something that goes up on the ramp also becomes holy? The Torah never really mentions the ramp, so we're learning it out from inferences. Talmud es hamizbeach. We learn out from the fact that it says in the pasuk mashachta es mizbeach olah. The word es is extra to teach us that. And usually the word es is a whole question whether or not we can be dorish it, but we know. In our parasha, the parasha of Vayeshev, we know that we are dorish one of the words es, and that's because there's dots on it. We're os es son avihem. Joseph went to see the sheep of the brothers went to see the sheep of their father. We were ot et, and Rashi there comments the dots are above the aleph in the Torah to tell us that they weren't really going to watch a sheep, but they're going to pasture themselves. Look at that Rashi. Ayin Sham. So Tam Omer es hamizbeach. So to teach us that the kevesh is also holy like the altar, whatever goes on the kevesh. Kli sharis minayin. How do we know whatever goes into a sacred utensil is also holy? Tam Omer kol nogea behem yikdash. Whatever touches them will become holy. By minei Reish Lakish, mi Rabbi Yochanan. So Reish Lakish asked the question from Rabbi Yochanan. Kli sharis ma'ushay kachras absulim. So let's say there was something that was disqualified. Meaning to say, if you put something in the klisheres, does it become holy if it's disqualified? Now, Rabbi Yochanan assumed that he was asking him about whether or not you could redeem it. Let's say, for example, Rashi says, let's say you put in a mincha, a grain offering that was tamei, that you sanctified in the klisheres. They assume that the question is, does it get kedusha saguf? Does it become inherently holy and therefore can never be redeemed? That the utensil sanctified it even though it was tamei, or do we say it doesn't become kedushas aguf, and so therefore you could redeem it, becomes kedushas damim, and it's able to be redeemed? So the Gemara says, so he says, Amrei Timisu, we learned this. Kishem Shem is Be'ach V'Kavesh Mekadshin is Arayon, Kachkel Mekadshim. Says, yeah, it becomes sacred and it becomes holy. So therefore, of course, it's holy. And he says, no, my question is, I mean to say that you can't be redeemed. So he says, no, my question is, yeah, I know that it becomes holy, Kedushas Aguf, but I wasn't asking about redeeming. I was asking whether or not it could be brought up as an altar. Does it become so holy? It says, Hanami Tanina, this also we learned. We learned this back on Pei Daled on the base on top of Pei Zayin on the base. Now we learned on Pei Daled on the Aleph. Actually, it says in the Mishnah, "Shekibu psuin v'zarku as damo." If somebody who received it was pasul, and then somebody else threw the blood, who is disqualified? So we see from here, aren't we talking about a case, my lav shekibu psuin v'zarku psuin, that who received that somebody who was pasul received the blood, and then or somebody sprinkled received the blood, and that this is something that if went up on the altar that it should not go down. But isn't the assumption here? Isn't the assumption here that if a person who was kosher was coming to sprinkle it, then lechatchila also it could go up the blood. And so we see from here that even though it was received by psuin, since it was sanctified in the klishares, you could even throw lechatchila. So isn't that the proof? So Reish Lakish says to Rabbi Yochanan, that's not a proof. Well, because that Mishnah could mean lo shekiblu psuin or inami shezarku psuin. Not that a kosher person came along and threw it, but it goes up if if it went up, it doesn't come down if a person who was pasul received it, or if somebody who was pasul had sprinkled it. So the Gemara doesn't answer that question. The Gemara brings another question. Avir mizbeach mizbeach. I mean, the airspace above the altar, is that like the altar or not? This is our old friend question on the airspace above the holy spaces. And it also relates to questions like, modern days, can you sell the airspace above your synagogue? I know there's a very prominent synagogue in New York that did that they got a lot of money by selling their airspace to an apartment building, and they made a lot of apartments, but is the airspace holy? Is the airspace above the altar holy or not? So Tashma, let's bring a proof. So it says in our Mishnah, Kashem Shem Mizbeach Mekadesh, Kach Kevesh Mekadesh. Just like the altar makes it holy, so too does the Kevesh. V'i Amris Avir Mizbeach Lav Kemizbeach Dami. If you're going to say the airspace is not like the altar, then Avir Kevesh, Nami Kevesh Dami. And so then the airspace above the ramp is not like the ramp. So so how would we ever bring it from the ramp to the altar if the airspace is not like the ramp? Because under those circumstances, it's going to be considered like it went down from the altar. So, and we learned that just like if it goes up, it doesn't come down. So too, if it went down, it doesn't go up. Now, the Gemara's assumption is that if something was disqualified, then the psulim that the psulim that went up don't come down, but the psulim that went down are not allowed to go up. So if it was a pasul on the kevesh, and you said the kevesh is like the mizbeach, then how could it ever go up? Because it ever crosses the airspace, it's like it went down, so it should never go up. So the Gemara's answer is no, the nugget way. No, you dragged it, so it never actually was elevated. You never picked it up. Gemara says, but what are you talking about? That doesn't solve the problem. No, but there's airspace between. There's a little bit of airspace between the ramp and the altar, and so therefore it was over the air there. So the Gemara says no. We follow the majority of where it is. Rubo kevesh kevesh. If the majority is on the ramp, it's like the ramp. The majority is on the altar, it's like the altar. So therefore, that's not a question. When the Gemara says, well, Tivshel Meham, maybe we can answer from here a different question that from here we could see that maybe if a part of the limb was on it, he had asked the question, is it considered like the whole limb is attached to that, even if not the entire limb is on the altar at that point? Tivshot yesh chibur. Learn from here that it's attached because we're following the majority of wherever it is. Gemara says, yeah, oh gosh, that's not difficult. Tivshot, that's the answer. We follow them that we view the whole thing as being connected, even though not all of it is on the altar. So Maska for Rabba Bar Hanan. I mean, if you want to say that the airspace of the altar is like the altar, then I'll ask you a different question. Olas ha'of, the Pasal b'machshav, our old friend Pigel, that if you had an improper thought about the olas ha'of, which is slaughter, which is not slaughter, but the mulika, the killing of it happens on top of the altar. However, how can you ever have an improper thought about a disqualifying thought about pigul of olas ha'of? Hakolta mizbeach, because we're going to say that the altar would have absorbed it, and therefore you don't have to say it's disqualified and take it down. It's allowed to remain up. Look at Rashi. Olas of shemalika sa berosh mizbeach. The malika is on top of the altar. How can you ever have a circumstance you disqualified it with a thought beyond the proper time? It doesn't matter because the minute you did the malika on it, the airspace of the altar, presumably you're holding the bird in the air, the airspace absorbed it, and so therefore it's on the altar, and we say that because of pigul, if it went up on the altar, it doesn't come down. So, and then the time for it is forever. Even if you want to say that there is lina on the top of the altar, and he upheld his thought, and that he would wait till tomorrow and burn it. He's allowed to burn it tomorrow. Whatever went up doesn't go down, and so therefore it's not beyond the proper time. It's not a pigul thought. It's not a pigul thought anymore. So therefore he hasn't disqualified with the improper thought. So the Gemara says that this is the answer. Even though Matkim is normally a challenge, here is challenging the question. So Rav Shimi Barashi says, Alam alo, what are you talking about? We can have a scenario where there is a psul machshava. Let's say he had the thought to take it down. He says, I have the thought when he does it to bring it down. Well, now he can't bring it back up. And so therefore it is beyond the proper time to bring it back down tomorrow and then bring it back up. Well, that's an improper thought because he can't bring it back up, and therefore he's slaughtering it beyond the proper time. So Gemara says, well, Hanicho Rava, this brings us back to the beginning of the daf where Rava said Lina Moelis, that if it's on the altar, it becomes Lina. But according to Rava, who says that there's no Lina, Ein Lina Moelis, that there's no Lina if it's on the Rosh HaMizbeach, then it doesn't matter that he says, I'm going to bring it down tomorrow morning. It wasn't Lina because he was on the altar. Mara says, no, Rabba Nami Mishkacha. So you can even have the case according to Rabba. Could go Namar Areni Mokal Manas Lorida Kodem Amanashachar. He says, I'll bring it down. I'll do the Malika, bring it down in the middle of the night. And so therefore it becomes disqualified because I'm going to bring it up. My thought is to bring it up after dawn, in which case it's expired. And it's disqualified, and it's a psulina. So the Gemara says, okay, well, if that's the case, but at least you should be able to answer the other question which we had in our daf. At least you should be able to answer that the airspace of the altar is like the altar. Because if you want to suggest that the airspace of the altar is not the altar, how would you ever have a case of chatas ha'of that's disqualified? Hechi mazem midama. How would you ever apply its blood? So let's look at the Rashi here. Chatas ha'of psua. Let's say you took a chatas ha'of, which can be slaughtered anywhere, could be do malik on it anywhere, and you did it on the top of the altar. Shalolashma. You did it with the wrong intent, Rashi says, and disqualified it. The afagav dinasis lamata, even though the chatasov is supposed to be done below, ha'amar mar le'el, we had said earlier, molka b'kol makom mizbeach, that if you did it anywhere on the altar, it's kshera. V'lo pasil, and it's not disqualified. V'lo pasil maladide el abazah. And so vehecha the molka the pasul berosh hamizbeach. Let's say you did the malika on the pasul on top of the altar. The kamlam b'kol hapsulin, and we have a position olo yardu If it goes up, you don't take it down. How are you allowed to uh, throw the blood? Are magbia umat is meaning you when you basically throw the blood from the bird, you're throwing it like that, and so you're picking it up, and so therefore it's like you brought it off of the airspace. So prove from here that the airspace of the altar is not the altar, because or else you wouldn't be able to bring it back up because whatever went down went up. Did you have a question, John? And also, not only that, sharp psulim always midama. All the blood of an animal that Rabbi Gamliel said if it went up, you don't bring it down. How do you apply its blood? How do you throw its blood? That it's like in the airspace of the altar, and it's like it went down. So the Gemara says, well, that's not a question. Dimagalahu. The Gemara says, no, what's talking about a case is that you don't actually throw the blood from the bird, but you press it against the altar. And that's how you apply the blood. And also the sprinkling of the blood, you don't throw it, but you press it against the altar. So therefore, you never took it up into the air. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Ha zahi mitzoi. That's not called throwing the blood. That's not called applying the blood. That's called pressing the blood. Hazrika, that's not called throwing it. That's shvichi. That's pouring it. That's not the way you do azah and zrika. That's not the way we described it earlier in our tractate. So therefore, Amar Vashi, yeah, if he was standing on the top of the altar with the blood, indeed, he wouldn't be able to do any of the zrika or the azah because the second you take it off, it would be down. So that's not the question, though. Kika Amri, well, what are we talking about? We're talking about the scenario is the Talinu Bikanya. So we're talking about a case where he put the. We're talking about a case where he where he put the bird where he put it on the ground, and he was standing on the ground, and he put it on a stick into the airspace of the altar. So the person himself is on the ground, and he's holding a stick, and on the top of it is in the airspace of the altar, and on the top of the stick is this disqualified carbon. So the question is, do we say that it's like a carbon that's standing in the airspace of the altar, and so it's on the altar, and so it doesn't come down, or not? Or do we not say that? So that's the question. And the Gemara says, Teku, we leave that unresolved. But if a person himself is on the altar, then it's not a question because since he's on the altar, then it's like the carbon is on the altar. So that's the only case. Okay, so that's today's daf. Baruch Hashem. Stop here.